This episode is sponsored by The Path, the coach-guided membership designed to help you make alcohol small and irrelevant in your life by removing your true desire to grab that next drink. Our science-based, compassion-led program allows you not only to shift your behavior and your relationship around alcohol, but more importantly, uncover and reprogram your subconscious conditioning and neural connections that have been keeping you stuck for years. With daily live breakthrough coaching, an intimate and supportive community, regular peer-to-peer connection calls, and a complete vault of resources, this is where your path to total freedom and effortless enjoyment of your new way of life begins. Join us at nakedmindpath.com. Hi, this is Annie Grace, and welcome to this Naked Mind podcast. And I'm here with Angele. Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Awesome.
Yes.
So why don't you take us back to the beginning for you? Like where did your drinking journey start?
Sure. Yeah. I guess to say I grew up, I was born in the 70s. So kind of an 80s kid with the kind of classic parents who came home from work and poured a rum and Coke or a Caesar. I think here in the US, you guys call them Bloody Marys, but I'm from Canada. So anyway, so this was the routine. So I very much kind of grew up with alcohol as part of life, right? The liquor cabinet that was stocked all the time. And I had my first drink at around 13, and then just to kind of goof off, and it was kind of the naughty thing to do. And then 14, some of my friends really got into drinking. And for me, I remember like it was yesterday, they were all having fun and I would start like crying and I'd feel, like the depressantness of alcohol really had an impact on me. So I remember wondering like, why is everyone having fun? And I would just be bursting into tears or just feeling really emotional. So at that age, I actually wasn't a big fan of drinking. And of course, at the time, I didn't put the two and two together. But as a child, I had experienced sexual abuse. And so not really aware that this is it was almost like alcohol just sort of removed these filters and all this emotion I had sort of stuffed down was kind of coming up with it just wasn't a good combination for me, right? So actually for me in my teens, I gravitated more to substances and then food and then kind of relationships. So continued my path to sort of try and control my feelings, all these feelings I didn't know how to deal with, right? Till eventually booze came back into the picture on the pathway to sort of like my own rock bottom, as you would say, right? Kind of in a relationship with someone who used drugs and alcohol, definitely was alcoholic. And then for me, it just got too bad. I started using harder and harder drugs until I was falling on my proverbial knees, so to speak. And that was when it kind of hit me, this isn't how I want to live my life. So my journey kind of became this path of, okay, I want to heal myself. And then I really connected that I knew I wanted to be a therapist. So it was like the journey was kind of onward and upward from there to kind of, starting with lifestyle changes and so reducing substance use, going back to school, going to the gym, eating the healthy food and all the stuff that, to treat myself as if I was worthy and kind of worth it, right? And then it wasn't in graduate school, I kind of two pivotal ahas that have transformed my pathway. One was discovering emotion-focused therapy. So I attended a training and sort of discovered that, these emotions that I've been trying to suppress and numb and get rid of my whole life are actually purposeful. Like we're supposed to have these feelings, right? So that really steered me. And then the second piece was discovering mindfulness meditation. So it was a teacher who said, if you want to be a good therapist, mindfulness practice helps. So I'm like, sign me up. What's this all about? And then when I began to practice, it just clicked. It was like, oh, of course we need to be present with ourselves, right? Like, so those two pieces were huge for me. And then so much so that I researched mindfulness. And that was actually the first time in my life that I realized this thing I'm drinking. At the time, I wouldn't say I had problem drinking, but I became so attuned to this was against what I was trying to cultivate for myself, right? So I actually became sober, just wanting to support my own spiritual practice at the time. And then met my husband, or who became my husband, who was a drinker. And then I, went in to do my PhD, got married, and had 3 kids in 5 years. So needless to say, kind of my spiritual path was put a
Wow.
bit on the back burner, right? So alcohol started to slowly, Annie, kind of creep back in this very interesting way. So I, was teaching meditation. I had my own clients, my own therapy, being a mom. Everything was fine, it seemed. And then I started to notice these. So I had 3 kids, so 3 maternity leaves. And I started to notice that, I would look forward to this glass of wine because I was kind of so sick of the mundaneness of the Groundhog Day, of the babies and the diapers and the cooking. And so it started to be like, I'll have a glass of wine while I cook dinner. And then suddenly making dinner for the umpteenth time isn't quite so bad. It was like this little reward and this treat. Kind of almost, I think it was replacing the self-care that I kind of didn't have time for, right? And then the wine became, I started to pay attention to how I would want to sit and have a glass of wine with my husband, and then we'd be interrupted. And then I realized, and I'd had this frustration. So when I kind of cued into this frustration, I was really associating the wine with connecting with my husband. And I was kind of being robbed of that. So it was like creating this frustration in me. But then I ignored it. So these were just these little ahas, right? That I more recently kind of started to notice. And so I'd say for the last decade, this relationship with alcohol it would come and go. Like there was this, I'm a mindfulness teacher, I'm a therapist, I need to be this put together person, but very much was, caught up in this wine culture of moms. And, my mother-in-law, she's a big wine drinker, so we'd make jokes about it, all that whole thing that we see, right? The jokes about moms and their wine. And I wasn't questioning it at all, really, at the time. And then I would get these little whispers. So like, for instance, when I would read an article about Brene Brown's blog and her being sober, and I had this twinge of I was irritated by it. And I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? Why does that irritate me?
Interesting. But you wouldn't have even asked if it wasn't for the mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think it was cueing things that it's like the whisper was still there where I wasn't fully at peace, right? I was drinking here and there, but it started to take up energy where, and of course we investigate, like in my teacher certification program, we were invited to, examine your relationship with substances, right? And I remember thinking, yeah, do I have to quit? Do I not have to? Like, what am I supposed to do here? And what would that look like? And it was creating this, I don't want to say frustration, but I was unsettled and I wasn't sure. And so I would tell myself, oh, as long as I just have a little bit, right? And so like Eckhart Tolle, says, if the body wants a glass of wine, that's fine, but listen to the body. So when the body says like, that's your limit, so I was like, okay, I'll do that. Like, but it just created so much psychic stress for me, Annie, like, because I wouldn't just stick with that one glass. I'd have a little bit more and I'd start to notice my body not feel well. Like, I'm a pretty small person and it wouldn't take a lot for me to get headaches or to start to notice kind of in the morning, like I'd be feeling not so great. And all of these little signs, I guess we could call them signs, but these little awarenesses but I would ignore it, right? So I'd notice it and then I would just be like, then I'd have the thought that, well, how would that work? Because my husband and I, we like to drink wine, like this thought, that it would be so inconvenienced to go sober again. So I just have to manage it and stay responsible with it. So this went on, this is how it was on, and was actually met you and learned about the naked mind. Was one of those moments where I was watching it out of interest as a writer. So because in the process of working on writing and you were being interviewed and so here you are, this book, this Naked Mind. And again, I got this like irritable kind of like feeling like, when we have envy, right, or jealousy, it's because it's tapping us into something that's important
Yeah.
that we need to look at. So anyways, but I ignored it. And then comes, the pandemic and COVID in March. And I have 3 children, and being a stay-at-home teacher is not something I would have ever signed myself up for, needless to say. And just found myself like coping by telling myself throughout the day, when I had so many difficult, challenging moments with my kids, trying to make them do things that they don't want to do. Um, it's okay, like wine o'clock is coming kind of thing. I started to notice myself like, okay, I'll cope with this difficulty now by just once 4 p.m., once the day is done, I'll just sit and have a glass of wine. And so sure enough, this was the first 2 weeks. And I found myself drinking to the point of feeling really ill. So getting hungover enough that my body was just like, this feels horrible. And it was really the kind of third time. And I woke up in the morning and I did the math. I was like, okay, Angele, that's 3 sort of hangovers in a 2-week period. Like, you can't ignore this anymore. And I just felt so, I guess, shame. I guess it was shame, but I want to differentiate, Annie, the different kind of shame, because I think shame, we can feel different kinds of shame, right? But this
Yeah.
wasn't me kind of falling down a rabbit hole of just, self-hatred or kind of hating myself type shame. But it was a shame where I was like, this is like, you're an imposter. It was like saying, okay, Angele, like, here you are writing a book because you want to help people kind of through their emotions, and this is your life's mission, but you're not handling yours so great right now. Kind of, shame, like, ugh, like a kick to the gut kind of feeling. And then the physical pain on top of it, it was just one of those moments, right? You can imagine. And I was done. And I was like, what was that book's name again? Pulled it up, read it that weekend, which, I had clearly made the decision at that point. I need to get, rid myself of this, enough of this, contemplation. Let's just do this. And your book was so pivotal because it gave me a real aha that I'll share with you, that I'm sure many people resonate with, Annie. And it was the explaining the impact of the alcohol itself, because here I was thinking, I need this, or this is helping me cope with how angry and irritable I am all the time. And little did I realize, after just a few short days of not drinking anymore at all, that I wasn't getting as angry, that I wasn't getting as irritable, and it was just like I'd been caught in this total spider web of, what we get dished out and what we don't know about the impacts of it. So the science of it was fascinating to me, and it just really supported everything that I had kind of already known. But for me, that was the new piece that was just enough to take me all the way through. Yeah. So I don't know if that's short
Oh,
or
great.
long, but there it is in a in a breath.
Oh, I love it. It sounds like, especially because of your work as a therapist and mindfulness teacher and practitioner, that would you say there was like sort of an added level of cognitive dissonance in your journey?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how it is for others. So it's hard for me to kind of put myself in another's thoughts, because, my role as a therapist, my role as a teacher is me. Like, I am one, whether I'm working with clients or students or just my own path. But chances are, like, I'm always just kind of, if I'm out of alignment, I'm just so aware when I am. Now, I may or may not do something about it, right? As I've explained, right? Sometimes I can, just like everybody, kind of not pay attention enough or not take action. But I would say I'm pretty attuned at noticing all these things, but we still get to notice and still look away and ignore, right? Until we can't anymore, or until the message gets louder and louder and louder. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And I think that sometimes we are more attuned to it when we're looking at other areas of our lives, but it's always there. And I just think you can, it's harder to see the inconsistencies when you're not sort of exploring all of this other healing work, which it seems that you're doing, which is so cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
So how have the people in your life reacted?
Mm. That's a good question. I mean, we're COVID, so we don't have a whole lot of contact with people, I will say, right? I remember being a bit nervous to tell my husband because that wine drinking thing was this thing that we did, and he loves red wine. So I was kind of worried, is he gonna be bummed out? Um, and when I brought it up to him, he wasn't at all. He was like, I'm proud of you. That's fantastic. And so, it's so funny, right? The way our mind can create these fear stories that don't actually end up being reality at all. So that was the case with my husband. And
Mm,
to be honest, other than kind of my own immediate family, which I don't see, so we moved to the US. And so all of our families up in Canada. And other than that, I haven't really shared with a whole lot of people. I mean, my kids, I didn't come out and say, "Mommy's not I didn't want to bring attention to it, that it was this big deal. And they just kind of eventually noticed that, oh, okay, so mom's not drinking wine with dad, like it wasn't even a thing. Um, Interestingly, so with my in-law side of the family, which are, I mean, you'd call them drinkers. They're all generally drinkers, right? So we did this Christmas party Zoom call, and I mean, that's not a situation I'm going to advertise. Hey, everybody, since you've known me, I'm not, drinking. But there was this one point where one family member asked, like, what's everyone drinking? Like it was this thing, right? And so I was very aware of it. I was like, just meant making a mental note of it. Isn't that interesting? Right. And kind of have feelings about it too that come up because, to me, and kind of your work here that you're doing here. I mean, I think when we do this work and we deeply look at our relationships with alcohol, there's a lot of feelings that come up. Like to me, it's very sad. There's this sadness that people aren't necessarily aware of all the impacts and kind of the commonplaceness of alcohol. Um, I don't know if you noticed that Super Bowl commercial that was con- uh, connecting beer with like moments of sharing and moments of
yeah.
connecting with people. So yeah, that stuff is just kind of upsetting. But anyway, I derailed a little bit to your question, but because there's really not a whole lot to share. With COVID, we don't
Yeah.
see anyone, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is kind of nice and kind of like, okay, well, we'll just have to navigate that when that happens. But yeah, there was so many Super Bowl commercials that you're like, where is this one going? Is
Yeah.
this going to be an alcohol commercial? Because it's just amazing
Yeah.
how in order to sell alcohol, they really have to equate it to all of these
Yeah.
very natural, um, very deep human longings like connection and
Yeah. Yeah.
joy and all this stuff that it's actually not really correlated with at all. But
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
how it has to go.
Right. But leads people to believe it's essential, right? Which is how it just gets so infused. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But it is certainly, I think, changing slightly. I mean, people have never been more interested in kind of a low pressure conversation around it. I think one of the biggest issues is that the conversations have been so black and white, so high pressure, so all or nothing. And while that, is right for a lot of people, it's not the best entry point into the conversation. And so I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
great to see that changing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, now I'm remembering I did tell this couple that came out, the one social event we had when we had people over in the summer. And he and the husband was really intrigued. It was interesting, right? How, and I've heard some of this on people talk about this on your podcast, that as we can begin to be more open and also not being black and white, but just not making it a big deal, right? The people that are also kind of wondering are also having certain ambivalent feelings or curious feelings. Then they I think feel more open to maybe reach out or start those conversations too, right? So I did notice that, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
interesting. And
Mhm.
it does become this ripple effect where I think the more low key we are in some ways, the more people are curious, which is
Mhm.
really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So cool. So is there any other aspects that you wanted to add or talk through in terms of your own story?
Um, well, I think, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I would mention, and it actually comes from a quote that you included in a newsletter that you sent out that I came through yesterday, which was there's a full spectrum of colors and we're meant to feel them all. I thought that was
Mhm.
really a beautiful way of saying that. And so now I'm kind of reinforced. So my this year experience of kind of coming clearer with my relationship with alcohol and, once and for all going sober, and it's really deepened my practice and deepened my passion to help others with the emotional components, right? It's like sometimes we need to be re-reminded. And for me, it was a very personal re-reminding about why this matters so much to me. Um, and why I care so much, because I think for so many people, part of why they're struggling with alcohol is not knowing how to deal with all these feelings that pop up for them. It's this commonplace, very socially approved way to numb, whether it's anxiety because you're a little socially nervous. I mean, I've heard that a lot in the work that I do. I used to work with college students back in the day. So, I mean, that was so clear. And just, people that want to change their relationship with alcohol, but it's run into some challenges. And so that whether it's the challenges, they find themselves with all these emotions and feelings that bubble up and they don't really know what to do with them. So that's kind of my work that I do to help people around mindfulness of emotion and self-compassion, which is what I would say, Annie, is one of the things that I so appreciate about the work that you're doing and makes you really stand out, which is in the spaces around addiction in particular. I mean, elsewhere too, but where we really need compassion, you're kind of standing out there, you and maybe Gabor Mate, saying we need compassion, right? We need it. And I believe it's both through my own experience and working with others, it's essential if we're going to help
Mhm.
ourselves. We have to heal, we have to have self-love, and in order to do the work that sustains the change, right? Is we
Mhm.
kind of have to dig into the pain of it and do it in a way that says it's not your fault. Like this
Mhm.
isn't, bash yourself on the head to feel badly here, but look at the pain so that you can change it, right? Yeah, that's where I feel mindfulness has helped me, and actually supported by the research being done right now on mindfulness and addiction, is that um, the invitation is to pay attention to the costs, pay attention to where, I mean, I'm thinking the study with smoking, but the same would be true of alcohol. And certainly that's what helped me, is I couldn't deny anymore. I stopped denying the negative impacts of what drinking was doing. And that really helped me reinforce, because then we remember, we don't actually want to suffer, right? Part of why I think sometimes we run to the beverages, if it's to cover up some uncomfortable, unpleasant feelings, it's because we're trying to avoid the unpleasantness, right? So if we
Yeah.
can take that same way that we are, just sort of hardwired, but pay attention to where it sucks. We tend to not want to do that. But if we do that with compassion, and this is where those two are so infused, right? Um, so it's not like I'm going to judge myself and berate myself, but I'm going to hold myself in compassion, but really look at this. What are the impacts? What's the physical impact? What's the emotional? Where is this really not serving me in my life and in my path, right? So that when the cravings come up, as they did a couple times, not often, but when the craving or the thought like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a glass of red wine? The shadow right away is, oh, but remember how bad that felt. And I can remember, and it's like a visceral remembering. It's just like, and then I can draw on that, and that just kind of reinforces in a very helpful way to kind of move past the craving, right? Because anyway, so I would add that.
I love all of
Yeah.
that. That's
Okay.
all just so true. And it's so important for everybody to hear, because we think illogically, but it is just what's drilled into us, that if we just punish ourselves or beat ourselves up or make ourselves see how bad it is and
Yeah.
how things have gotten so bad, like let's just dwell in it, then somehow we're going to give ourselves some motivation to change.
Yeah.
And it just is not true. And
Yeah.
what actually the science is now showing very clearly is that self-compassion is the way to change. And I think that the way to awaken self-compassion is by understanding why you're doing what you're doing in the first place. Like you said, it's not your fault. Like once you start to see that the brain is actually doing exactly what it was created to do in order to ensure your survival, it just never was created to have the sort of substances and the things that we're exposed to these days at the levels we're exposed to them, then you're like, oh, okay, this isn't because I'm some, awful human. And
Mm-hmm.
you can start to awaken that self-compassion. I think that is the starting place for the change, which is so good.
Absolutely.
Love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So cool. That's
Mm-hmm.
great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you the question I kind of always end these with, which is, if you were going to go back in time and talk to yourself of, kind of, I guess, the two phases in your
Mm-hmm.
life, which was kind of the pre-kids and then the mommy wine culture,
Mm-hmm.
um, what would you tell her?
Um, Probably just keep paying attention, right? You know, um, whether it's intuition or whether it's signs or whatever we call it. I mean, I'm so grateful that I value the inner whisper. I think that's helped me and guided me to be in an amazing place and doing what I love and having this great family, is because I've always listened to, well, not always, but I was always aware of the whisper. But when I listened to it is um, when I would make the choices that were kind of getting me back on my path. So pay attention and just practice love. I mean, it's difficult and that sounds kind of hokey. And I know, because I teach compassion, it's difficult for many people to let that compassion in. So
Yeah,
I'm just going to even say that, because I don't want people, if they try and take that on, it's like, oh, hey, just love yourself. Right.
right.
But even just note that. So even just for people to understand that the research shows there's this backlash to bringing compassion to ourselves. And that's also our social conditioning, where we've kind of come from this ancestral idea that it's maybe, the jokes of on SNL back in the 90s, on the self-help movement, like they make fun of, I forget that guy, Stuart Smiley or whatever that character's name was, he'd stare in the mirror and be like, I love myself. And so we would laugh at that. But I think that has gotten us away, or people think it's too cheesy or it's too hokey. But the reality is it's healing,
Mm.
so get past the awkwardness, get past the hokiness of it, and start to turn the same care and love you give to the people that you love, and start directing it towards yourself. And
Yeah,
that might be by, eating a healthy meal, and it might be by doing some meditation. It might be by just talking to yourself and being kind instead of critical, whatever that looks like for you. Um, that's to me the best advice I'd give myself and anybody else. Yeah.
yeah, and I'd add into that, to get past that resistance and awkwardness.
Yeah.
I would really question yourself and be like, dig in and ask, why am I judging this so harshly? Like, what am I afraid of? What is this triggering for me, that if I was to embark in kind of this journey of self-compassion and self-love, like, what is it that awakens in me this very harsh judgment of that?
Yeah. Like,
And
where
try to
did I
find the
learn
fear
it?
there. Yeah,
Yeah.
where did I learn it? And what am I
Yeah.
afraid of? Because I think there
Yeah.
is a fear. And I think the piggyback question to that becomes, what is it about the guilt and blame and beating myself up that's serving me? Because there is very much a reason that we do it. There's certainly the societal reasons,
Hmm.
but there's also very tangible reasons, which it makes us feel in control in the moment. It makes us feel better in the moment to beat ourselves up because we're like, oh, we're doing something about it. It feels like action. It feels like we're taking some steps towards changing through the action of beating ourselves up. We're like, we deserve it, or we're righting the scales, or there's some sort of equity in it. And so we put all this focus and attention on it without seeing that, although it maybe scratches the short-term itch to make a change or to, right the scales because feel we deserve it, it doesn't actually go where we want to go, which is to actually change things. And it feels very counterintuitive to let ourselves off the hook and to say, no, it's all okay, because we don't believe that will actually change things. And so I think it's, really getting under the skin of why are you holding on to that beating yourself up? And I think that's, a lot of creating positive emotion around this self-compassion is really understanding what the negative emotion that's keeping you from that is. Because the truth is, we are born with self-compassion. Like, we are born with very, I believe, divine love for ourselves. You can just see it in any little kid. And then that gets kind of changed over time, but it isn't as much that we need to go at this from like, I need to try on something new. It's much more often that we need to unlearn the things that are keeping us from this flow of love that already exists between us and us, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most common fears is, I definitely heard this when I worked with college students, like, if I'm not hard on myself, I mean, they think they're going to just end up on the couch, binge watching Netflix, like, and just become loafs and do absolutely nothing. But having care for ourselves doesn't have that impact at all, because we want to be productive. We want to be on our path. We want to be doing things. And if you just imagine, right? Like, what's it actually feel like when you're on the receiving end of some, massive critical diatribe towards yourself? I mean, it's diminishing. It doesn't actually motivate, but you're right. It's one of the grand illusions of our day, I think, that people, are unlearning. Absolutely. And that's where the freedom will come. Let's hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so true.
Yeah.
It's so true. Well, this has been awesome. What a pleasure. And thank you so much for coming to share your story and being here with me.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Hi, it's Annie Grace. I wanted to interrupt this podcast, I guess the end of this podcast, to say that if you're totally serious about actually and truly and forevermore transforming your relationship with alcohol, really leaving it behind in the rearview mirror for once and forever, and changing your psychology about it, we have a program called The Path that I've created specifically for you. Now, it's not for you if you're still dabbling or trying to figure out where you want to be, or maybe even if you still want to moderate. All those things are fine. That's great. But if you're beyond that and you're like, no, I just want to be done with this. I'm ready to invest some time, and I'm ready to just make this happen. I want the answer. I want the easy way out. Then I want you to check out nakedmindpath.com and join us in the path, where you receive coach-guided and community support so that you can truly make this lasting change that you want in your life. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, as it truly helps the message reach somebody who might need to hear it today.